Welcome back to another episode of Masters Class, everyone. We're going to get into nation building in Latin America. What do we need to note before we really kick things off? Well, for one, we need to note that the Latin American revolutions that we're going to be covering and the nation building that's going to exist during this period, particularly in the early half of the 19th century, of the 1800s, predominantly they're influenced by the American Revolution and the ideals of the French Revolution that spread to Latin America. They're also going to be heavily influenced by the actions of Napoleon. We're going to get more into that in just a moment. Now, when the Portuguese and Spanish colonies rebelled, they, for the most part, win sweeping independence, political independence. They become recognized independent nations. The thing that they don't achieve, though, is political stability in the aftermath. It's not so easy to set up a new republic. And this is why we're going to see a lot of these Latin American nations that sort of throw off the shackles of their colonial overseers, of the Spanish and the Portuguese, wind up turning to authoritative, sort of really dictator-esque leadership when their nations become independent, when they gain independence. But they're born from the ideals of the American and French Revolution. So let's talk about who are these people that are going to wind up taking on these leadership roles. What does the socioeconomic hierarchy look like in the Latin American colonies of the early 19th century? Well, it kind of looks like this. By the end of the 1700s and going into the 1800s, we're going to see a socioeconomic hierarchy that kind of looks like this, right? So we have the Creole elites. They're going to play a huge role in the determination of how these Latin American colonies become independent nation states. So the Creoles were descendants of the Europeans who had settled in Latin America. They are typically of the landed elite. You might even say that they are the ancestors, if you will. Well, I could say they have an ancestor in people like, say, if you're going to Mexico City, I'm going to bring up this map right here, Hernan Cortez. So Cortez comes over as a conquistador, and he's looking to become an encomienderos, right? He wants to set up the encomienda system. He wants to have these massive, large tracts of land, and on those massive, large tracts of land, he wants free labor, basically slave labor through the mita system. And this is how they become rich on these plantations. And this is going to be a prevalent model throughout, Latin America, all the way from Mexico, down all the way to Buenos Aires. We're going to see from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, we're going to see this sort of system persist. So slave labor is very real in this part of the world, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, especially when we get to San Domingue. We're going to talk about the Haitian Revolution. Now, these Creole elites, they kind of come from the encomienda system as encomienderos. They are in control of massive swaths of territory, huge estates. We're going to talk about how large later on. And, they run the businesses of the plantations, and they stick to, what makes them money, cash crops. They don't really engage in subsistence farming. But because they're wealthy, because they're landed, because they're the elites of society, they're going to be attracted to the principles of equality of all people in the eyes of the law, free trade especially, and free press. They want to have a representative government where they actually have more of a say in their self-determination than, say, leaving things up to representatives over in Spain and Portugal, because there are definitely those Creoles who have never been to Spain or Portugal. And a big reason why they're kind of drawn to these ideas is, one, they see this in the American Revolution. They see that a group of people kind of overthrew, a kingdom, the shackles of a kingdom that, didn't necessarily represent their best interests. And one of the interests that they know, of course, is, what they think are punitive taxes. Well, in these colonies that are controlled by Spain and Portugal, the Creoles have to kick up what's called the royal fifth. So that's 25% of what they make has to go back to Spain and Portugal. And keep in mind, some of them have never been there, and they are represented by people who serve in governments around their respective kings that don't really seem to represent them necessarily. They don't have their interests in mind. So that's one big aspect. Another is that they really get this notion when the Peninsulares come over. So the Peninsulares are kind of, representatives of the Spanish and the Portuguese monarchs, officials who reside temporarily in Latin America, not permanently like the Creoles. And they're there for political and economic gain. They take their money, they drain the wealth of the regions they inhabit, and then they just simply return to the homeland. So whereas the Creole elites, even though they have to kick that royal fifth back to, the monarchs of Spain and Portugal, they're spending their wealth, whatever they make, that is, that they don't have to kick over in the royal fifth back home, they're spending it to their home, where they grew up in. So if you grew up in and around Mexico City, that's where you're basically building around your plantation, you're reinvesting in the business. So this is money that's being taken away. And this is a problem that's been persistent in this part of the world, in the Latin Americas, since the 1600s, with Cortez and the first major establishment of the encomienderos system. So they resent the Peninsulares. They do. Because they just see them as, kind of mosquitoes coming in. They suck the blood away, or the silver, from, this host body, and they take it back. They fly off. So they see opportunities. And I want to note, not all the Creoles, not all the Creole elites really subscribe to the ideals of the American or the French Revolution. They only subscribe, some of them, to the point where they get to benefit. So you're going to definitely have Creole elites who are very much about the old conservative regime, the conservative order, so long as they benefit from it, so long as they are put into a new position of power and authority. And there's going to be several examples of this that we'll talk about in these Latin American revolutions that are going to take place. But we'll also discuss those Creole elites who are very much champions of the ideals of the American and French Revolution. They've read the works of the great Enlightenment philosophers, and they want to implement them here in their homes. So this all kind of comes to a head, not so much with the French Revolution, but really the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. So when the French Revolution hits that new phase, the Republic has been set up, and now the Republic gives way to Napoleon, and Napoleon becomes Emperor of France, and the Republic gives way to empire and imperial ambitions. This is when Latin America will see the opportunity to establish their own nation states, to strive for independence. Nationalism plays a huge role, as does liberalism. And we'll talk a little bit about industrialism as well. So Napoleon is basically going to give the Creoles an opportunity for change when he and his brothers overthrow the monarchs of Spain and Portugal. Napoleon's going to seat on the throne his brothers, the Spanish throne and the Portuguese throne. And this is going to have a massive impact, because now these historic authorities, the Spaniards and the Portuguese, they have a very weak grip on these colonies now. And it's here that opportunity is born. And we're going to see between 1807 and 1825 a series of revolts that enables most of Latin America to become independent. Very dissimilar, so unlike the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, which mostly failed. So let's talk about one particular group that kind of starts it all off. So we mentioned this western island, this western part of the island of Hispaniola, San Domingue. This is a very unique island. You might say, like, wow, that's pretty dinky, but yet 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the world's sugar came from this one island. Pretty impressive stuff. So this is a real cash cow. And it's also different because it's not a Spanish or Portuguese colony. It's a French one. But the Spanish are going to get involved, as are the British. So what winds up happening is that, much like the other Latin American nations, the French Revolution is going to have a huge impact on the independence movement that takes place here on San Domingue. Now, before we get into how it goes down, we need to talk a little bit about the socioeconomic hierarchy. So we've noted that we have, in most of the Spanish colonies, the peninsulares, people born in Spain, they go, they come back, they go, they come back, they take the wealth away with them. We have the Creoles, people of European descent, born in the colonies, very much based on their white Europeanness, their success, the Creole elites of society, very landed. And then below them you have the mestizos and the mulattoes, right? People of mixed Native American and European descent, and people of mixed African and European descent. And below them we have the indigenous peoples of these Latin American colonies and people of African descent who happen to be free. And below them, those who are put in bondage as slaves, typically the indigenous people, as well as those who have African descent. Now, this is going to be a little bit similar and a little bit different when we talk about this French colony in San Domingue. So at the very top, much like most of the Latin American colonies, we have the Grand Blancs, right? These are the big whites, if you will, the large land-owning elites of white European descent. They are free, of course. They usually are put in positions of power and authority. They own large swaths of land, plantations. They have slaves. They run the coffee plantations. They run the sugar plantations. Technically, beneath them, the Petit Blancs, or the free whites. They're small players. They're free, but they're not exactly the landed elite of society the way the Grand Blancs are. They don't have as much power or authority or say in, government. They certainly don't have as many slaves or as large of plantation as the Grand Blancs. They might not be all that wealthy at all, the Petit Blancs. Their status in society is based solely on the color of their skin. Now, beneath the Grand Blancs and the Petit Blancs, but in reality, you also have above the Petit Blancs, in a way, the gens de couleur. All right, and you can see the population differences. Now, the gens de couleur are people of mixed color. Best way to describe them. They are not always, they're free, but not necessarily equal in status in society. But you certainly do have plenty that you would say are well elevated above the Petit Blanc, but certainly below the Grand Blancs, and how this sort of socioeconomic hierarchy works. In fact, you can see some images Here as an example of just one such individual who would be, a prominent member of the gens de couleur. These would be individuals who also, like the Grand Blancs, own large swaths of land, massive territory, own plantations, and despite either being a mixed person of color or a person of color who is of African descent, who is black, they own slaves. They engage in pretty much this identical behavior patterns as those of the Grand Blancs. Now, the only thing that separates them from the Petit Blancs, if you will, is that they are not white Europeans, although there was a special designation that they could earn that would basically name them essentially as, white Europeans, as Grand Blancs. But this is not inherent, all right? So below them, you have slaves. And you can see right here, these are going to be indigenous people and predominantly, overwhelmingly, people of African descent. In fact, the island of Saint-Domingue, every year prior to the Haitian Revolution, will import 40,000 African slaves to work on these coffee and these sugar plantations. It is a staggering number, so you can tell just by the population size difference how critical a role race, skin color, and slavery, of course, and the plantation system play on this island. Well, things are going to change. There's going to be a massive shakeup. What winds up happening is that you're going to have the French Revolution, which turns out the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And in the Declaration, or the Doromek, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, there is, this idea that all men are created equal. And all men shall be free and slavery shall be abolished. This is, pretty forward thinking. Word is going to reach its way to the island of Saint-Domingue, and the gens de couleur are going to be very interested to learn more about this. So a delegation is going to be sent of the gens de couleur to, kind of like a fact-finding mission. Hey, is this for real? And they are basically told, yes, this is for real. Slavery is to be abolished. And all men, regardless of the color of their skin, are to be made equal. So they're going to go back to Saint-Domingue and basically, try to take part in a more serious matter in the socioeconomic hierarchy, in the power structure, in governance, not just voting, but leading politically the island. This is going to be a problem. It's a problem for a few people. One, the Grand Blancs, who do not want to share equal status with the gens de couleur, and the Petit Blancs, who are afraid that the gens de couleur will now have elevated status above them, on par with the Grand Blancs, and they will be beneath them. Because although the Petit Blancs are for sure free, this would mean that with the gens de couleur, and this idea that slavery is to be abolished and all men are, basically equal, well, where does that put these free Blancs who don't necessarily own land or anything like that in regards to these slaves? The Petit Blancs, basically, they want to use, they want a revolution themselves, but the revolution is to enslave people to make sure that, the status quo is kind of maintained in a way. So there's going to be a revolution / counter-revolution element going on here. What winds up happening is the gens de couleur have a delegation, like about 300 people, and in a sort of counter-revolution that prevents them from equal participation in governance and self-governing, and even the idea of abolishing slavery, 22 members of this 300-person group from the gens de couleur are going to be hanged publicly. Well, it's about at this point that when word spreads of this, and it spreads fast, that there's going to be a massive slave uprising, because if the Grand Blancs and the Petit Blancs are going to do this to individuals who are free or landowners, what will they do against those who are at the very bottom rung of society? When slavery is supposed to be abolished and they refuse to recognize this, they are going to uprise. And it is going to be a bloody uprising. See if I can't find a... There we go. Yep. I mean, it's going to be a massacre. It's going to get really nasty really quickly. And you know, rightfully so. So how do the slaves rise up? You know, what leads to their success? Because this is going to wind up being, in world history, the most successful slave uprising. You're going to have people who are the most disenfranchised in some of the most brutal plantation systems on earth turn things around to become you know, an independent, internationally recognized nation by the rest of the world. Well, it happens when an individual by the name of Toussaint Louverture, a former slave himself, leads 100,000 enslaved people in revolt. Louverture was noted for being of an exceptional intellect, and oftentimes, militarily speaking, he's kind of noted as something like the Haitian George Washington, although you could argue he has a better military track record than George Washington. What winds up happening with Toussaint Louverture is that when he was still a slave, his master would often put him into positions of authority and power. Maybe we should relax on the word power, though. Positions of, you know, perhaps of authority. You know, he allowed him to exercise his gray matter on a regular basis. He would put him in charge of accounting and business transactions and making sure things are running efficiently. And so Toussaint learned a lot about, and he also could, you know, read and speak in several different languages. He also found himself in, you know, a position where he was able to sort of discern the most efficient, most effective means of accomplishing his goals. And he just proved to be a natural military genius. So what winds up happening is that he is going to successfully play the various European powers off of one another. So in this uprising, they are going to secure some semblance, not of necessarily independence, not right away, but some semblance of self-determination, of power, of authority. They learn very quickly to use their environment around them, to rally around his leadership, to engage in hit-and-run tactics and guerrilla warfare. And what's going to wind up happening is that when Napoleon hits the scene, things are going to change a little bit. Napoleon declares that, you know, slavery is still in effect because he recognizes the financial value of the coffee and sugar plantations on this particular island of San Domingue. Well, the Spanish are going to get involved, and they're going to try and help, if you will. And the British are going to come on and hit the scene. And then the French basically realize between the Haitians, the Spanish, and the British, there's really no help. There's no hope. So freedom will be granted to Toussaint Louverture and all of his followers. Slavery is abolished. Once he gets this freedom, he is going to then attack and basically, you know, repel. He's going to repulse the advances of the Spanish and the British. He's going to beat them away from the island quite successfully. So he beats the French, he beats the Spanish, he beats the British. He secures freedom for the Haitians. They're going to declare Haiti, you know, an independent nation. and he is going to proclaim himself basically governor for life. Um, governor for life. Well, this is not going to last long. What's going to happen is that a coalition will conspire against him, one of which is an individual by the name of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was one of his most trusted and gifted lieutenants. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was a brutal individual. He was far more brutal than Toussaint Louverture, but this is what made him one of his most, if not most effective officer. He's going to conspire with the French authorities, an officer by the name of Brunet. They want to basically lure him to a safe spot, and then they're going to wind up, having Toussaint Louverture captured and taken away. He's kidnapped. He is imprisoned. He's shipped over to France. He's imprisoned. He's tortured. He's interrogated. He's malnourished, and he'll die in a miserable state in a French prison cell. All while Jean-Jacques Dessalines basically takes his place. And he is also going to finish the job. He will finish ousting any sort of French ambitions, as Napoleon had sent over a group under the command of an individual by the name of Leclerc. And the vast majority of Leclerc and his men will die trying to fight Jean-Jacques Dessalines and these Haitian guerrillas and in guerrilla-based warfare. But they're not prepared for the heat. They're not prepared for Jean-Jacques Dessalines and his tactics. And they're certainly not prepared for the yellow fever that will absolutely ravish the French. Basically, at this point, Napoleon recognizes that he needs to cut his loss and that it's just not worth it anymore. They will recognize Haiti, and with this recognition, the rest of the world will recognize Haiti as a power. And Jean-Jacques Dessalines actually goes a step further and will proclaim himself king of Haiti. But wicked is the blade that cuts both ways. Betrayal is a full circle. It comes back around to him, as people do not care much for this idea of a Jean-Jacques Dessalines who will be king. He will be betrayed in the end, and he will actually be massacred and hacked up into pieces via machete. So things are not always the most stable. When it comes to the Latin American revolutions. But Haiti does serve as an example to the rest of Latin America as being the most, perhaps, successful revolution in their ability to win their freedom so ardently. There's a template that exists here for success that can be emulated. So they will seize control of all of Hispaniola, and then on January the 1st of 1804, what was Saint Domingue becomes Haiti, and it becomes the first independent, if not most successful, state in Latin America to have won its independence, I should say. So let's move that to Mexico. Things go a little bit differently in Mexico. Everyone has their ups and downs. Mexico certainly does. Mexico certainly serves as, a constant struggle for not just liberation and independence, but stability. So beginning in 1810, Mexico is going to experience a revolt. So what they're going to experience is leadership from a Creole elite, so very different from the island of Haiti, which was a popular slave uprising. Miguel Hidalgo, a parish priest, a Roman Catholic parish priest who lives in a village about 100 miles outside of Mexico City, is going to rally support. He is going to rouse the local Native Americans and mestizos to free themselves from the Spanish. He says, quote, "Will you be free? Will you make the effort to recover from the hated Spaniards the land stolen from your forefathers 300 years ago?" Now, what makes this different is that when King Ferdinand VII of Spain is basically ousted, he's removed from the throne, Napoleon seats his brother. This is an opportunity for both the Peninsulares as well as the Creoles to sort of band together. Now, what they claim is that what they want is the restoration of a divine right monarch. They don't really actually want this. They say they want this. This is just so they can justify claiming more land and power and governmental authority for themselves, to have a stronger grip over the mestizos and the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Because now that Napoleon's sort of taken over, they have this like, oh yeah, we just want to see, Ferdinand VII. We're not going to be represented by this French monarch. We want Ferdinand VII to be back on the throne. Well, that's actually going to wind up happening, but we're going to circle back to that and why that matters. So what also matters is that Father Miguel Hidalgo does not, unlike the other major Creole elites, want to land grab or anything like that. If he wants to land grab, it's because he wants a more equal, fair distribution of land for people who have historically been oppressed. So on September 16th of 1810, he's going to wind up leading this very ill-equipped army of thousands of Native Americans and mestizos in an attack against the Spaniards. He is led as he sort of not just preaches, but he espouses the rhetoric of the French Enlightenment philosophes. So, liberté, equalité, fraternité. He wants to see, them have access to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, engage in representative government, be the representatives of that government, to enjoy the liberties and the freedoms that the people of the United States seem to enjoy, and the people of France as well. Well, his forces are going to be crushed. Initially, they see some success town from town, village to village, adding thousands and thousands more to their ranks until they eventually swell to about the size of like 50,000 indigenous peoples and mestizos who are all trying to liberate themselves as well as Mexico from Spanish authority. But what winds up happening is that, the Spanish are going to come back, and they just prove to be more militarily resilient. They're better equipped, better trained. And they're going to be crushed. And Father Hidalgo is going to be captured, tried by a military court, and then sentenced to death, and then shot after being lined up by a firing squad, as will be another individual Father Hidalgo had sort of inspired and led, a Jose Maria Morales. So both Father Miguel Hidalgo and unfortunately meet their demise. They meet their end in their attempt to sort of help to liberate the mestizos and the indigenous peoples of Mexico. This is where the Mexican War for Independence takes a turn. So what winds up happening is the role of these indigenous peoples and the mestizos in the revolt really frightens the Creole elites and the Peninsulares. And this is where they sort of really band together. They're afraid. They're afraid of the masses. So they're going to cooperate in defeating the revolutionary forces because, as they say, they want a restoration of the divine right monarch of King Ferdinand VII. So they're going to be successful in doing this and sort of crushing with Spanish authority, with Spanish aid, this sort of resistance from the mestizos and the Native Americans. Now, what also happens is that once that's done, and King Ferdinand VII is put back on the throne, especially after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, The Creoles and the Peninsulars then decide, you know what, this is when it becomes true that, oh, we didn't actually want a divine right monarch. So they are going to decide to overthrow Spanish rule. Uh, they want conservative elitism. They want to become an independent nation. Uh, they said they wanted to be ruled by a monarch, but just one of their choosing. So they're going to rebel themselves. So yes, these conservative elites wanted an independent nation ruled by a monarch. They didn't want to be a colony ruled over by a king on the Spanish throne. So this is where they're going to select a Creole military leader by the name of Agustin de Iturbide. And he is going to set up the new government. But he's also going to serve as an example, a template that we'll see kind of emulated going forward. He's not going to last very long. In 1821, Mexico declares itself, independent from Spain. He is going to name himself emperor in 1822, and then, as you can see very quickly, he's deposed in 1823. He's going to have a chief rival by the name of Vicente Guerrero, who kind of wants to be president and, maybe even emperor. But a third individual who we'll talk about in a bit prevents either of them. He aids in the overthrow of both, and he promises both of them that he's going to help them. He plays one off the other. He's a very sly individual, and he's also going to serve as an example of why it's so much more difficult to establish stability with a new government than it is to actually win a revolution. Now that you've won the revolution, what are you going to do with it? And that's a big problem that most nations fail. This is where most nations fail. So Mexico becomes something of a republic after this, as most of them will. Just highly unstable ones. So let's talk about that. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. We're going to cover about two more of these individuals who helped to liberate large swaths of colonies from the Spanish and from the Portuguese. The first is Jose de San Martin of Argentina, and the second is Simón Bolívar of Venezuela. So both, they're like Father Hidalgo. They're Creole elites. They're like Agustin de Iturbide. They're like I said, they're Creole elites. They are also very much inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment philosophers. They're going to be hailed as the liberators of South America. Now, let's focus on Bolivar first. So Simón Bolivar, the country of Bolivia, gets its name from him through these liberation efforts. He's going to be inspired by the French and the American revolutions. He's born in Venezuela to some very wealthy landed elites as a Creole elite himself. He's orphaned at a young age, and by the time he reaches the age of 16, he's going to witness Napoleon Bonaparte's success, and he's going to also be very involved in reading the works of the Enlightenment philosophers. And it's these ideas, these actions that he sees, that's going to inspire him to come back to Latin America, come back to Venezuela, to free Hispanic America from Spanish rule. So when Spain is invaded by Napoleon and the monarch Ferdinand VII is unseated, South America felt his influence. He is going to be very successful. He'll have ups and downs, he'll have his defeats, but his victories stand out. and we'll talk about why they do in a moment, because they're different. He is going to lead these revolts in Latin America as a ambassador, as a military leader, as a president, and then eventually as a dictator, oddly enough. He is going to be a lot like San Martin, the fact that when he goes from town to town, village to village, city to city, whenever he's successful, he's going to liberate those who are held in slavery and bondage in those areas, and that will help to swell his ranks. And we're going to see this lead to his success as he leads revolts in New Granada, which is Colombia today, and Ecuador. And by 1819, these countries formed to become Gran Colombia. Now, Jose de San Martin, he's similar to Bolivar, landed elite. He's going to go, much like Bolivar did, over to Europe at a very young age, actually younger than Bolivar. He's like 6 years of age. But instead, he doesn't come back right away. He's going to sign up and kind of serve in the Spanish military. He's going to serve in the army for the Spanish monarchy. So in 1811, he's going to ask to become stationed back in Lima, Peru. Instead, he'll be put at a base in Buenos Aires. And here, there's a gap in history. We know he used his strategic training, his military skill, and persistence to liberate various places, including Lima, Peru, which we'll talk about in just a moment, from the Spanish government and those who can, those who support the royalists, those who are royalists. But we're not sure as to why. Why does he do this? I mean, we have to assume, much like Bolivar, he's exposed to the Enlightenment philosophers through his education. And perhaps this is one reason why. Maybe he also is exposed to not just the tenets of the French Revolution and the ideals, but, he's equipped with historic military knowledge of the American Revolution, and perhaps even studied some of the tactics of Napoleon himself. And maybe this is what serves as the inspiration. So he's perhaps quite similar to, say, Father Hidalgo, and especially to Simon Bolivar on that aspect. But one thing's for certain, between the three of them, he is very well trained. He's a very well trained individual. And he's going to use that training to his advantage, much like Bolivar. When he goes from town to town, village to village, he is going to wind up liberating those who are enslaved or held in bondage in these areas. So San Martin liberates in 1810 Argentina, neck and neck with Bolivar in his liberation efforts. And January of 1817, he leads his forces, and this is where things really take a massive turn. The Spanish are held in very deeply in Chile, Spanish authorities, those who are loyal to the crown. Well, he's going to use geography to his advantage. He's going to force his troops over the Andes Mountains to attack the Spanish in Chile. Now, the thing here is that this is a foolhardy feat. It is cold. It is, at least 3 miles above, 2 or 3 miles above sea level. So oxygen is very thin. It's a deadly trek. It's a hard trek. And we know this because 2/3 of the pack mules and horses die during the trip. The soldiers will suffer from a lack of oxygen and severe cold while crossing the mountain paths. And it's not a blunder. Despite this setback, it pays off massively for them, because the Spanish, they didn't dream that San Martin would actually cross the Andes Mountains. They had thought that the attack would come from elsewhere. So when they do make it past the Andes Mountains into Chile, they're completely surprised. And as a result, they are badly defeated. And in February of 1817, Chile will be declared independent in 1818. So there's one major stronghold left. And in 1821, San Martin will advance on Lima, Peru, the center of Spanish authority. But he knows he can't do it alone. And neither can Simón Bolívar. But with their forces combined, they can take on Peru. They can take on Lima, Peru. And they're going to do so quite spectacularly. San Martin has a better military track record. Bolívar is possessed of an intellect and a leadership that San Martin sees as having serious potential. And so after they liberate Lima, Peru, and Peru is declared independent, San Martin is actually going to just disappear. He calls it good. He's done his job. He's going to retreat to Europe to sort of retire, if you will. He leaves the reins and the mantle of leadership and control over to Bolívar. This man is a leader. Perhaps he realized what we all historically know to be true. It's one thing to win a revolution, and it's another matter to steer it in the next direction. And maybe he felt that he just wasn't equipped to do so. So he leaves it to Bolívar. So by the end of 1824, Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, named for Bolívar, Chile, all had become free of Spain. Now, brief note, Bolívar, despite, and this is like a reoccurring theme, we see this, we saw it in Mexico with, Iturbide, we see it with Bolívar as well. After they free, the majority, a good portion of Latin America, for whatever reason, he sees something in the Republican system, in the Republic system, as weak. So what's going to wind up happening is he is going to declare himself president for life. President for life in Venezuela. This does not go over well. He creates enemies as a result of this sort of attempt at dictatorship. He barely escapes assassination. He goes into exile, and he'll die of tuberculosis in 1830. And it just seems odd because this keeps happening. This is a very common theme in the Latin American revolutions. So we saw it in Mexico. We've certainly seen it here in South America, in Venezuela, with Simón Bolívar. Honorable mention, Brazil. Brazil is different. So what we have here is when King João, we can go back to the map, when King João of Portugal is ousted from his seat, he is going to retreat to Portugal's massive colony of Brazil, and he loves it there while he's there. He takes his son, Prince Pedro, his family. In fact, after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, he doesn't want to return back to Portugal as the consort of Europe tries to put him back on the throne. The Portuguese people need to be ruled by a divine right monarch, and you, sir, are the king of Portugal. He's like, oh, man, I just really like it over here. But he ultimately realizes that he has to go back to Portugal, so he does. He leaves his son, Prince Pedro, behind. And Prince Pedro is going to be convinced by the Creole elite of Brazilian society to basically throw off the shackles of being prince, become king. And what you should do is declare Brazil independent from Portugal. So by doing so, he can become king. The Creole elite stop kicking the royal fifth back to Portugal, so they don't have to pay 25% overseas on what they make. So this is a win-win for the landed aristocracy, the landed elites of Brazilian society. It's not so much a win for the indigenous peoples of Brazil. as slavery, or certainly not those who are of African descent either were brought over as slaves. Uh, Slavery is going to persist as a result of this lack of having to overcome through a revolution, a real like hard fought or bloody revolution. Uh, they resist liberal ideas that are very common in the French from the French Revolution. They apply only to some people. This is where nationalism really plays a role. As a result, slavery persists in Brazil up until like 1888. It's very long lasting. So this is very much the champions of conservative elitism. Not unlike what you would see after the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. So the Central American states had become independent in 1823, and in 1838 and 1839, they divided into 5 republics: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. So we've seen threats to independence from outside, but there are also internal threats. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. So the continent of Europe, we've certainly seen trying to restore, the Portuguese and the Spanish crown after the defeat of Napoleon. And they want to reestablish their colonies, but there are going to be 2 factors that prevent them from doing so. One is going to be the British. So the British are very much an outside force. The second would be the United States. So let's start with the United States first, very briefly here. The United States, under President James Monroe, issues in 1823 the Monroe Doctrine. This basically says that the Americas are off limits for any colonization efforts, and if you want to step, then the United States is there to answer the call. They will bring the full might of the United States military. And if you can look at our map here, not super impressive. The United States military barely won their own independence against the British, nearly lost it again in the War of 1812, and by the skin of their teeth won it again. So the rest of the world's not super concerned about the United States military system at this time. It's really not that powerful. What is super powerful, though, is the British Navy. Everyone knows it. They respect it, especially the European powers. They've seen what the British Navy can do and what it's capable of, especially with the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. So it's going to be more so the British Navy than it was the Monroe Doctrine that deters the other European powers from sort of invading or standing in the way of trade that's going to exist between the United States, England, and Latin America. Initially, England wanted to bring the United States in. They said, hey, us together, we can make sure. The United States just said, no, we're going to go solo on this. So it wound up being just due to proximity, as well as the English Navy, that both these nations are going to benefit tremendously from the independence of these Latin American countries. So that brings us to nation building and the rule of the caudillos and inequality that's going to exist. You see, between 1830 and 1870, these Latin American nations see some major setbacks. I mean, they're facing various problems, some serious problems. I mean, they are experiencing staggering loss of people. As an example, in the Mexican War for Independence, 425,000 people lost their lives. So this is a tremendous setback as far as the people that were. This is about, for the population at the time, 1 in 600 people died from having participated in the War for Independence. Property is another big issue. The day of the Creole elite, the landed elite, has certainly not gone away. They've, in fact, only gotten more prosperous. They've only taken more land. They control more of the governance of these Latin American countries because there's no monarchical crown that oversees them anymore. and livestock. Livestock is also going to be greatly depleted. We saw this certainly in Haiti. There was a special kind of beef, a smoked beef that they specialized in Haiti for a while, known as boucan, and the boucan ranchers no longer able to make much of a profit. They actually turned to piracy for a while. So during the course of the 1800s, we're going to see these Latin American nations that won independence become very economically dependent on the more industrialized Western nations as they're going to trade raw materials for fine manufactured goods and advancements in mechanical technology that are very prevalent in industrial United States and certainly England at this time. So that's what's going on externally. Internally, we certainly see these sort of Creole elites, much like the encomienderos from Hernan Cortez's day. We have the caudillos now, strong leaders, renowned for their use of military force, supported by the landed Creole elites of society. And it's through this aspect of these caudillos that when you see these republics that begin to emerge, they're more like dictatorships. They're dictatorships because true republics, are very hard to operate, especially with people who have never really had any experience in self-rule. So now that you have this new government structure, people are relying on what they've always relied on, which was force, what they always know, what they're familiar with. So there's good and bad that comes from this. One, the good is that you can kind of keep some semblance of order through fear, both from having an army as well as a police force. Some structure in the fact that people are going to either have to join the army or the police to sort of gain some upward mobility in society, especially if you're a mestizo or free indigenous person. You were not enslaved. If you were, especially if you were, not enslaved. But slavery is still very much going to be an issue that persists throughout the Latin American world, as we said, particularly as we noted, Brazil. But some of these caudillos, despite having this, authority, this power, they do good things. They're modernizers. They're going to build roads and canals and ports and hospitals and schools, comprehensive education systems. Others, however, are incredibly destructive. And the most destructive we could probably point our finger at would be Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. So this is why you're going to see this instability in Mexico. Because when we had Agustin de Iturbide sort of proclaim himself emperor, and he's basically ousted a year later, and his rival Vicente Guerrero is not able to claim president or presidency for life either, is because of this man, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He would take the reins of the Mexican government. You can probably tell from him that he is, he's highly decorated. He's considered to be the Mexican Napoleon. He is much like, Vicente Guerrero or Iturbide or Simon Bolivar. He is, one of the Creole elites of Mexican society of his day. And he's also very keen, kind of like how Toussaint Louverture was, in playing one side off of the other. So, I get support temporarily from this side, and I use them long enough to overthrow that side. And when that side's been overthrown, I betray, the OG side that I was on, and now I claim all the power for myself. Kind of what Toussaint did when he played the French. Well, he played the Spanish and English off the French, and then the French off the Spanish and the English, and then eventually the French were ousted finally in Haiti. De Santa Anna kind of does this with, Iturbide as well as Vicente Guerrero. He promises to support both of them, and he also aids in the overthrow of both of these individuals, ultimately to claim power for himself. And when he claims power from 1833 to 1855, he's going to have kind of the reins and control of government, and he's noted for misusing and misappropriating state funds, to spending lavishly on himself and his family. He halts reforms. He's very much a conservative elite, and he creates chaos. Granted, chaos does come his way, but he certainly makes things worse for Mexico. So what does that mean? Well, it looks like this. And around 1835, American settlers move into the Mexican state of Texas. And with them, they're going to bring slaves, and they're going to, exchange in some unscrupulous, what he considers to be unscrupulous business practices. So to sort of oust them, he is going to he's going to agitate them for one, and he does this by declaring slavery is illegal. They have to convert to Catholicism if they want to move and stay in Texas, and he's going to raise their taxes. Well, this is enough to get these Americans from the United States who have moved into the Texas region to sort of revolt, to rebel, to rise up. And what's going to wind up happening is that there's going to be a famous rebellion of these U.S. settlers in Texas and part of Mexico at a Franciscan mission. All right, there's going to be kind of a missionary, mostly abandoned missionary settlement that is known as the Alamo. And it's here that he is going to ultimately be successful. He's going to wind up defeating these U.S. settlers. He's going to quell this uprising temporarily. There's going to be some very famous American personalities that are going to fall and die at the Battle of the Alamo. Dave Crockett, who was at the time a former U.S. senator, he's without a doubt the biggest of the sort of celebrities at the Battle of the Alamo. Well, this is enough to sort of incense the United States, particularly those Texans that did not participate in the Battle of the Alamo, to rebel, to rise up, to declare Texas as an independent state. They'll be led by their commander-in-chief, one Sam Houston. This is while Houston will become capital of Texas. And they will ultimately be successful in sort of declaring Texas independence and winning it, and declaring statehood in 1845 as they're going to defeat Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. After Texas is sort of annexed, if you will, declares its independence, and then is granted, I should say, statehood in 1845, this is when Mexico looks at this as an American ploy to steal territory and land. So war will be declared between Mexico and the United States between 1846 and 1848. Mexico loses. It is humiliated. It's going to lose almost 1/2 of its territory in the United States. So territories in addition to Texas, such as Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, California, all will go over to the United States. This is a disastrous war. And it was mostly agitated. I mean, there are several nuances, but certainly Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna made his contributions known, as he was a primary agitator to those Americans who were moving into the Texas region. And one has to wonder whether or not things would have developed the way that they did had he not made these proclamations against these early Texans. So fortunately for Mexico, despite this tremendous loss, Santa Anna is going to be ousted. His peg leg is also going to be secured as a side note. The Springfield Museum of Military History still houses his famous peg leg to this day. Santa Anna had, prior to the Mexican-American War, lost his leg due to a cannon shell. He was hitting his hand and his leg with a cannon, and he was very proud of this peg leg. A lot of money went into it. It's a fine peg leg. The thing is, this infantry from Springfield, Illinois, during the Mexican-American War, after he is ultimately seized, when he makes his escape, they will seize his leg from him and keep it as a sort of a relic, as a souvenir. And so it kind of serves in a way as, this artifact, a metaphor for the loss of all this territory of Mexico to the United States. But despite this, Mexico is going to see a period of reform from 55 to 76. This is where Benito Juarez hits the scene. He's very unlike de Santa Anna. He is a very liberal, not conservative elite, very liberal, forward-thinking, progressive leader. He is not a Creole elite. In fact, he is the son of Native American peasants, which makes him very different from the leadership we've seen so far. So President Juarez, he introduces very common, for the time, reforms that were known to be implemented in both France and especially the United States. He actualizes these Enlightenment age ideas. Finally, separation of church and state. This is a big one. Redistribution of land to the poor, because the Creole elites have so much land. We'll talk about how much. And of course, a universal education system for all of Mexico. So very forward thinking. So he's a very different kind of caudillo. We also have individuals like Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina, who was supported by the masses, known for bringing about radical change, being extremely popular. But the problem is, when you have individuals like, say, Benito Juarez, or even de Rosas, or heck, even de Santa Anna, those who are loved and reviled, what winds up happening is, because they have so much authority, so much personal power, such a cult of personality, is that when they die or they lose power, civil wars often erupt and then create further instability. So you've got these pockets of stability followed by pockets of instability throughout these Latin American countries as a result of this. So this is a fundamental problem that exists for most of the new Latin American nations. And because they're so dominated by the landed elites, the large estates, despite reforms by individuals like Benito Juarez in Mexico with redistribution of land to the poor, large estates are the norm. They're the way of life in Latin America. As an example, by 1848, the Sanchez Navarro family in Mexico possessed something like 17 estates made up of 16 million acres. And it's not like they're growing food on this land that can support the overall population of Mexico. They are kind of basing their crops that they choose on cash crops. They're following the industrial model that was put forth by Great Britain and even the United States to some degree, and that was popular while they were still colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese. This is how you make money. You set aside large tracts of land, and you focus on one major cash crop: coffee, sugar, wool, tobacco, wheat, hides. You go all in on one of these raw materials, and then of course you trade it. Uh, you trade that as well as whatever foodstuffs you have to industrialized, developed, mechanized nations like the United States and especially Great Britain. Uh, and this is how the railroad industry is going to get built up in places like Mexico, and how the machines of the industrial era make their way into Latin America. And of course, they can do this because they are still using a system of inexpensive labor, because the landed elites, the Creole elites of society, still hold the land, they hold the wealth, they hold the social prestige, they hold the political power, they run the governments, they control the courts. And they're going to dictate who gets to participate in these new republics and in what capacity they participate in them. Once again, slavery still existing in Brazil up until 1888. They really hold on to it. So as a result, the masses experience dire poverty. So British investors, American investors, they all pour in funds into helping develop and establish strong trade relationships with these newly independent Latin American countries. So the Latin American countries are going to be dominated by the Creole elites, and they're going to become very dependent economically on trade with foreigners. And, you know, they're going to be dependent on these Western nations much the same way that they were when they were still colonies, even though they were no longer colonies. That'll do it for us this episode. See you next time.